Why do we have no early records for the first 100 years of the movement? Why would the Muslims go to war against two major empires? Why didn't Muhammad just name a successor? Why was Al-Aqsa built on the site of the Temple Mount? No one knows the answers to any of these three questions.
Hello, nice to meet you. My name is No One, and I'm going to tell you the answers to these questions. So today I'm going to be responding to a lecture on YouTube titled The Golden Islamic Age. It's by an individual called Professor Jiang. He's a Canadian-Chinese professor, a graduate from Yale. He's teaching in one of the high schools today in China, I believe. He has a YouTube channel called Predictive History. He speaks about history in general, but he spoke about Islam, about Christianity, about Judaism, and about Prophet Muhammad as well. He has been getting a lot of, let's say, traction recently. He's been having interviews. I believe he had also an interview recently with Nico. It's only a small part of it, and I saw a lot of misinformation. So I thought I must respond to this. I must make a video and comment on what is being said in that lecture. It has like 400, 500,000 views, like 500,000 views on YouTube. So I think it's worth definitely responding to. And I want to preface that by saying that he's not like an enemy of Islam or anything like that. He actually, we agree with him on many issues, many historical things, or many issues, let's just say, specifically about geopolitics, I would say. We agree with him a lot. He's not an enemy of Islam. He praises Muslims and stuff like that. But in this lecture, there is so much misinformation. I also want to preface it by saying that he admits that this is just my opinion. It's not a historical fact, which I kind of find contradictory, but I'm going to comment on that like during the video. Yeah, so let's get straight into it and see what he has to say and comment on it while he's giving his lecture.
Some questions that we will look at today about the Islamic Golden Age. The first major question is, while Europe was in its dark ages, Islam was embarked on its golden age. So the first question is, how did this happen? Why was there this divergence? Second question we're going to look at is, what ended the Islamic golden age? Why would this period come to an end? The third question we're going to look at is, eventually, how did Christian Europe overtake the Muslim world? Some quick facts about Islam. It is the world's second largest religion. Christianity has 2 billion people. Islam has 1 billion people.
Yes, that's not 100% accurate. If you actually look at the stats today, it's way more than that. I think the numbers of Muslims are underrepresented, and I think the number of Christians is overrepresented when it comes to these kind of statistical things, because, you know, they would like say someone is a Christian when they're counting the people who doesn't go to church, doesn't believe in Christianity. It's culturally Christian, and if you go ask them, are you a Christian, they'll probably say that they're not. They're just born and been baptized, but they don't follow the religion. And there's a big number, huge number of conversion. We know that Islam is the biggest growing religion in the world. And we're talking about conversion rates. You look at the Pew Research Institute study, for example, they talk about conversion rate, not birth rate or anything like that, because that's another hoax that's being spread. But whether you want to look at the conversion or the birth rate, Muslims are more than that. I believe Muslims today, like without a shadow of a doubt, they're not going to be under 2 billion people. And the numbers of Christians are overrepresented, but they're overrepresented for a reason, because they don't want people to think that, oh, Muslims are so many and the Christians are so little. So there's also reasons behind these numbers which are not factually represented.
They are divided into 2 major sects, the Shia, which is based primarily in Iran, and the Sunni, which is everywhere else. The Shia and the Sunni, the only major difference is that the Shia believe that only a direct descendant of Muhammad's grandson Ali can be the leader of the religion, whereas the Sunni do not believe this.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely an understatement. There's a lot more disagreements between Sunni and Shia. Maybe in the beginning, in the start, yes, you can say it started with this idea that who should have been the successor of the Prophet ﷺ after his death. But later on, it's become an entire religion with a new set of beliefs. And it's not just about Ali being the successor, but they said like that his entire lineage, there must be someone from his lineage. You have the 12 people, 12 imams, and that you have it each time. You need to have a representative appointed by God as the leader of the Muslims, and he has to be from the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ, which is obviously not Islamic and not from the Quran and Sunnah, hence why they are a small minority, like you're saying. So, but it's definitely not accurate to say there's just one small disagreement or something. There's more disagreements about the companions of the Prophet, about the wives of the Prophet, and certain beliefs to do with infallibility, with people knowing the unseen and stuff like that. There's a lot more differences that arise later on that it's not as simple as just like about Ali radiallahu anhu.
Now, this is a religion of 1 billion people, so there are many different belief systems, many different sects within this cosmology, but this is really the major difference, okay, between the Shia and the Sunni.
Yeah, there are many groups of people who believe in different things, but in reality, all Muslims believe in the same Quran, believe in the same Prophet, believe in the same God. So unlike other religions, where the differences in belief will be big differences in theology and who's God, who's not God, and a number of books that they follow and issues like that. It's not the case when it comes to Muslims, or these, like, if you want to use the term sects, their disagreements are not going to be like core foundation level, like, for example, a different Quran or something, different numbers of books in the Quran and issues like that.
So Muslim means to submit yourself to God, to believe in God, and to submit yourself wholeheartedly to Him. And Islam was founded by a man named Muhammad, who the Muslims consider the prophet of God, the final prophet. And Jesus was the penultimate prophet. And the legend is that at age 40, Muhammad, who is a merchant or a trader, he has a vision. He goes into a cave to meditate, and the archangel Gabriel visits him and reveals to him certain visions that he has memorized. And these visions become the basis for the holy book of the Muslim tradition called the Quran.
Okay, that's another point which is not accurate, definitely. The first revelation the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had was in the cave of Hira. Cave of Hira is a cave where the Prophet ﷺ, because his people were idol worshippers, he used to go in seclusion. He used to try and worship God, and he had a first encounter with Angel Gabriel. And a few verses of the Quran was revealed. That's it, a few verses of the Quran. And then he came back, and then he was informed that he was a messenger from God. And then he had revelation of the Quran in 23 years. So it's not like that the basis for the Quran was that one incident of revelation, which was the first one in the cave of Hira. No, Quran was revealed throughout the 23 years of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Mecca and when he was in Medina. So that's not an accurate description, I would say, when it comes to that, for sure.
And Muhammad understands that his mission is to be a messenger of God and to reveal the truth of God to the pagan society in the Arabian world.
Yes, here is a very important point, because here he confused the Islamic definition with the linguistic definition. So there is a technical definition to words, and there's a linguistic definition to words. Yes, so the word Muslim or Islam, it means submission. Muslim is someone who submits. But Islam itself, from an Islamic worldview, when Allah uses the word Islam or the Prophet uses the word Islam, it doesn't mean just someone who submits his will to God. That can include so many different people. That word Muslim specifically means the one who believes in the 5 pillars and 6 articles of faith. So a believer is the one who believes in 6 articles of faith. A mu'min and a Muslim is someone who believes in the 5 pillars. And a Muslim can be a mu'min can be a Muslim. But when the word is mentioned together, so every mu'min is a Muslim, essentially. But when the 2 words are mentioned together, then we make a differentiation that the Islam refers to the 5 pillars and Iman refers to the 6 articles. That is a technical definition of the word Muslim. The linguistic definition, like we said, is the idea of submission. But the Islamic definition is about the 5 pillars. And we see this definition in the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, where Angel Gabriel himself comes to the Prophet. And then he tries to teach the people, or he's teaching the companions the religion. And he says to the Prophet, what is Islam? Then the Prophet doesn't say submission to the one true God or submission to one God. The Prophet says Islam is to testify there's nothing worthy of worship except Allah, and the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger. Then to pray 5 times a day, basically the 5 pillars of Islam. And then he asks him, what is Iman, faith? And then he says, what are the 6 articles of faith? So this is what a Muslim is. And he uses this wrong assumption, and based on this wrong assumption, he is going to make a lot of, I would say, issues and problems during his lecture. He's going to conflate a lot of different terms and a lot of different teachings, because he's mixing technical definition with the Islamic definition.
Eventually, Islam will spread from the Arabian desert to all across the Middle East. They will conquer the Persian Empire, and they will take at least half of the Byzantine Empire, including the richest parts of the Byzantine Empire, which are Syria and Egypt. They will also take Jerusalem, where they will build something called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And legend has it that Muhammad ascended to heaven from this place. Now, what's really important for us to remember about this place is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it's still there in Jerusalem. And it is built on top of something called the Temple Mount. Remember, in the year 70, the Romans burned down the Second Temple of the Jews, the holiest site in the Jewish faith. And then the Muslims came and built the Al-Aqsa Mosque on top of the Temple Mount. Now, this is a very strange thing to do. If the Muslim tradition is open, inclusive, and tolerant, and Jews are welcome into the tradition, why would you build a mosque on top of the Jewish holy site? That doesn't really make any sense. And quite honestly, this has been a mystery to everyone. No one has been able to figure this out, okay? So we will today attempt to solve one of the great mysteries in the Islam tradition. Why was the Al-Aqsa Mosque built on top of the Jewish Temple Mount? Okay?
All right, so before we solve this mystery, because he's going to mention it again later, I'm going to give a bit more history on this idea. He essentially put the picture of what we refer to as the Dome of the Rock, Qubbat al-Sakhra, and he called the Qubbat al-Sakhra, or the Dome of the Rock, is Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's not accurate. And that's a very ABC kind of mistake, right? That's like elementary school when it comes to history, a mistake. That's not something that if you just did a bit of research and Googling, you would know that this is incorrect. So the Masjid Qubbat al-Sakhra, this mosque of the Dome of the Rock, is not what we call Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. It's not what Muslims believe to be the Masjid al-Aqsa. So perhaps you have a mystery there because you are conflating terms and ideas and understanding. Later on, like I said, I'm going to explain more history about this. But Al-Masjid al-Aqsa is this entire space that you see that is fenced, which is like 144,000 square meters. And it has a lot of different historical, let's say, monuments or historical things within, like around, I don't know, like a lot, like over 100 things that are there that are historical. And this entire fenced area is what we refer to as Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. There's even a musalla there, which is a place to pray, which people also refer to as Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which is the Masjid al-Qibla, the Masjid al-Qibli, the mosque of the Qibla. And it was called that because it's in the direction of the Qibla. And we don't say that that's alone also is Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, like I said, is the entire space. So it's not like Muslims have built Al-Masjid al-Aqsa over the Temple Mount. That's not accurate. But like I said, I'm going to talk more about his history because he's going to bring up this idea later on. But for now, let's continue hearing what he says.
There are 5 pillars of Islam. It is an extremely simple and clear religion when compared with Christianity and Judaism. Okay, there are 5 pillars to the religion. First of all, you have to believe that Allah, God, is the only God. Okay, and this mirrors the Christian and the Jewish faith.
Yeah, okay, so this doesn't mirror the Jewish and the Christian faith. And Muslims don't believe the Jews and the Christians are monotheistic in every way, especially the Christians. We believe they are polytheistic in their belief. They believe Jesus is God. They believe in the Trinity. So I would disagree with this idea that says that the Shahada is mirrored within the Christian and Jewish faith. The Shahada is also not just that there is one God. That's an incorrect definition of the Shahada. The Shahada is Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu means I testify or I bear witness. La ilaha, la means no. Ilaha is from aliha ya'lahu ilahatan fahuwa ma'luh. Ma'luh is ma'bud, the one who is worshipped. So la ilaha, there's nothing worshipped. There's nothing worthy of worship in the Islamic definition. So when you say la ilaha illallah, there's nothing worthy of worship except Allah. So when you look at the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, we say definitely this idea is not mirrored within the Jewish or Christian tradition. And if it was, you didn't have all of these verses in the Quran saying, oh, people of the book, oh, people of the book do this, oh, people of the book believe, people of the book do not exaggerate in your religion. Because if they already have the Shahada, then all what the Quran is going to be doing is to tell them to follow the Prophet. So that is definitely not accurate.
You are required to pray at least 5 times a day, facing the direction of Mecca. You must give money to the poor. You must fast during the holy days. The last thing is you must make something called the Hajj, which is a pilgrimage to the holy site in Mecca and perform rituals in Mecca. This is something that all Muslims must do, and you will have the poorest Muslims. They will save their entire lives just so that they could make this Hajj. Okay? The Muslim people are probably the most devout, the most religious people you will meet. They take their religion very, very seriously.
I appreciate him saying that, and that's why I said he's not like an enemy of Islam. He seems like there is some good information what he says, but I would say overall this lecture has a lot of historical errors, and we're saying basic historical errors. So I'm highlighting this to show that he's not like an enemy or something. So we shouldn't be like angry about what he says per se. but he's saying a lot of misinformation, for sure.
There are three major mysteries to the history of Islam that we still haven't really solved today. Okay, the first mystery is, why do we have no early records for the first 100 years? What for the first 100 years of the movement? Another strange thing is, why would the Muslims go to war against two major empires, the Romans and the Persians? That's kind of suicidal. They didn't know they were going to win, so why did they go to war? Okay, that's the first mystery we'll solve today. Second mystery is, remember I said that the Shia and the Sunni have a major sectarian divide. The Shia believe that only the descendants of Muhammad's grandson Ali can be the caliph, the leader of the Muslim people. The Sunnis don't. So why didn't Muhammad just name a successor and avoid the civil wars that will erupt after his death? The third question is, why was Al-Aqsa built on the site of the Temple Mount? And again, no one knows the answers to any of these three questions, and no one will ever know because so much of the historical record has been lost to us. But I will try to provide you with an explanation, okay? Given my understanding of the Islamic world, which, by the way, is extremely limited, okay? So please ask questions, please challenge me. I'm looking at you, Doug, okay? All right.
So he's going to repeat these questions again later on in the lecture. I'm going to respond to them when he tries to answer them himself. And I'm not going to give you guys the answers right now. I'm going to wait until he tries to answer them, highlight the problems with his representation of these questions, and then give you an actual answer to these questions.
All right. Okay, so today's topic is Islamic Golden Age. So let's just have a quick look at the Golden Age. At the height of Islamic influence, there were a few centers of incredible cultural creativity. One such site is Bukhara, Uzbekistan. It's still there, guys. You can get on a plane, like Doug did, and visit it. It is an incredible city. I say that without actually having visited it, but I've heard terrific things from Doug. And you can go online as well and look at videos. But it is an incredible city. And it shows you the immense creativity, the artistic creativity of the Islamic Golden Age. But the main cultural center of the Islamic Golden Age is Baghdad, okay? It's not so beautiful now, but back then it was really the center of the world. It's a round city, and it's a new city. This is a topographical map of the city. As you can see, it's surrounded by the Tigris and Euphrates, and it is a round city, okay? One of the few round cities of that time. Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, which started the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid Caliphate is the successor to the Umayyad empire, okay? And this is where the Abbasid Caliphate was. And this is what Muslims consider the height of their civilization. The thing that's really important for us to understand about the Abbasid empire is that not only were they influential in the Muslim world, but they eventually would come to create the world that we live in today, okay? So when we think of globalization, we think of this as a recent phenomenon. But look at the trade routes that the Abbasid Caliphate would create over its 300 to 400 year history. It connects the entire world, okay? As I mentioned last semester, globalization has always existed to a certain extent in world history. But the Abbasids, the Muslim religion, would take these existing networks and make them a lot richer, a lot more dense, and a lot faster, okay?
So I think that's a very, very important point that he just made, because you see first how the Islamic Empire is that it was connected with the rest of the world. There's trading systems going on, there's a multiculturalism going on, there's sharing of values and ideas and cultures and understandings between the people. But what's more important is, as he says, that Muslims, what they would do, if they take over a country or take over a civilization or whatever, they would take existing ideas and they would let them flourish. They would take existing resources, they wouldn't take them out to themselves. They would leave the existing resources and they would flourish that land and that country. And it would allow people to practice their faith in harmony. That is the difference between Muslims and the other religions or other ideologies when they conquer and take over lands. And when we look at the Western conquest, or when we look at the Christian, when they took over people's land, or we look at Western empires or American empires, any of these empires, whenever they take over land, what they do is they plunder all of the resources that is in that land, in that country, and they take it to themselves, and they allow their country to advance, and they take the knowledge and everything within that country, and then they leave that country for destruction, basically. They destroy the infrastructure of the country. They take everything within it, and they try to become superior while they make any empires or any place that they went in before, any country, they make it inferior and they completely destroy it. So the difference between Islamic expansion, if you want to use that term, and Western expansion is that. So a lot of people come and say, oh, when Muslims talk about like what Westerners do to Middle Eastern countries, or generally even African countries or any countries when they take over these lands, they say, oh, Muslims are complaining, but look at your empire, what you did. Yes, but when Muslims expanded, they did not destroy countries and plunder the resources and destroy their infrastructure and left. Give me the example of Muslims doing that. That wasn't something that Muslims were doing. They look at all of these lands. Look at Baghdad as an example, where he said as the capital, was the capital, the major capital of the world, or the capital also of the Muslim empire at the time. It was the center of civilization in the world. That was a place that Muslims took and flourished, right? So it's the difference between when Muslims do something in comparison to when Western civilizations expand or do the same exact thing.
The main center for cultural production in the Muslim world is something called the House of Wisdom. And its model is the Library of Alexandria. Okay? Remember last semester we discussed the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. And its mission was to be the first university to take all Hellenistic knowledge and culture and systemize it for dissemination. Okay? And the House of Wisdom was doing the same thing, where it would take all knowledge and culture within the Islamic world and outside the Islamic world and systemize and standardize it for mass dissemination. Okay? So the things that they were doing were they were taking Hindu numerals. Okay, so 0, 1, 2, 3. We still use them today. They took them from India, and again they standardized it and disseminated this knowledge. They took works from Aristotle and Plato, translated it into Arabic and Persian, and then disseminated it. The main contribution of the Islamic Golden Age to world culture is in actually mathematics. Okay, so they took all the math in the Greek world and in the Persian world and in the Hindu world, and then they would systemize it and then build on top of it. Okay, this is a rendition of the House of Wisdom. This is where the three major creative civilizations would meet and exchange ideas, right? The Greeks, the Jews, and the Persians. They would also take ideas from the Indian tradition and the Chinese tradition as well.
Yeah, so Muslims had this idea of the House of Wisdom, or Bayt al-Hikmah, where you would have translation of literature from other languages, have discussions, you have flourishing of science. So this is another example where you have the Western civilizations and their arguments about Muslims. Oh, look, the Westerns, a lot of the people in the West, like, oh, look, Muslims, they took over, they would, there's no free speech, there's no education, there's no science. When you look at Islamic history, when Muslims were in power, they allowed knowledge to flourish, they translated foreign knowledge, they experimented, and allowed science and knowledge in general to flourish. Whether it is, and we're going to talk about some of the examples of Muslims within the Islamic empire, scientists and otherwise, and great figures in history which shaped the history that we live in today. But this is a clear refutation of this idea that Muslims were like, anti-free speech, anti-discussion, anti-dialogue between different ideologies. That is not definitely true.
Ibn Sina is probably the most famous intellectual of the Islamic Golden Age. His books, his works were admired in Europe. Okay, so the Islamic philosophy was being exported to Europe, where it would have a major influence on many of Europe's major thinkers. You may have heard a man named Leonardo Fibonacci. You should have heard of him in math class. Well, at this particular time in history, he was going to Baghdad to study from the leading mathematicians of this time and taking their ideas and importing them all back to Europe. Okay, so this is Ibn Sina, and the Latin name is Avicenna. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, is also a major intellectual at this time. Just to show you how influential these two were in Europe, let's look at Dante's Divine Comedy. So Dante is in hell, and there in limbo, he's meeting the most influential, the greatest philosophers in human history who have influenced European civilization. Obviously, he's going to name Socrates and Plato, okay? But guess what? He also names Averroes and Avicenna, okay? So Dante is acknowledging the debt Europeans have to Islam. This is important for us because the Muslim intellectual influence on Europe has been whitewashed in history. This is something you do not learn in school usually. But without Islam, you can make the argument that Europe could not have modernized, okay? And later on, I'll explain why that's the case.
So that is, again, another very, very, very important point to highlight. So he's mentioning these names. He didn't talk about this, but it's very important. He didn't mention this idea. So he mentions people like Ibn Rushd, people like Ibn Sina, Al-Khawarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, Hassan al-Haytham. He mentioned so many people, but he didn't mention why they were translating or Latinizing their names and changing their names into Avicenna and Averroes and Algorithmy and all of these translations. It's not just simply because it was a different language. It's not that, because you can type the letters in your own language and you can still say the name. The main reason they were doing them is because this idea of the history and civilization of the West being stolen from the Muslims, they had to cover it up somehow. So if they go and they steal knowledge, like he's saying, going to Baghdad and learning knowledge from Muslims there, or people who were within the Islamic civilization, physicians or otherwise, like, you have Ibn Sina and you have all of these people, you have their books and editions being taught in books of physician in today in the biggest schools in the UK and America. You have statues of people like Al-Razi in France, I believe, and other places. They have these people, right? And they Latinize and they change their names because they don't want people to understand that, look, the source of these knowledge are actually Arabic names or Muslim names, that this knowledge actually came from Muslims. So if I change the name that like a student is reading, has no clue this guy's a Muslim, right? Like if you go to most of these people in these universities, being taught this knowledge, just like 16 different editions when it comes to physician and knowledge of medicine, taken from Ibn Sina or whatever, you ask them, who's Avicenna or Avicenna? Or you'll say, oh, look, he was a Greek person. No, he wasn't Greek. He just Latinized the name and changed it to Latin and Greek. So when you're reading it, you think, oh, all of this knowledge actually comes from the Greeks. All of this knowledge actually comes from other people, the Roman Empire accepting Christianity, rather than it actually came from the Islamic Golden Age. This idea of whitewashing, he just said whitewashing. You have to actually explain what it means, the significance of people like that. So he's going to also mention different people.
Umar Khayyam is also another famous intellectual, poet, philosopher. This man, Musa al-Hazami.
Obviously, he's talking about Al-Khawarizmi, but he's not a native Arabic speaker, and he says that himself, so we're not going to talk about him butchering the names or whatever. But yeah, and then algorithm, or the idea of algorithms come, and this, computers using laptops, and all of this stuff is also, and algebra as an entire science coming from Muslims, coming from someone like that. Most people don't know. They don't know where the idea of the word algorithm, where does it come from and where does it trace back to. So many people don't know this. And it's really sad.
This name is Al-Hazan, and he invented physics, basically optics. Again, extremely influential. And again, these ideas will be imported back to Europe, and they will become the basis of the Renaissance. Okay.
Yeah, so here he mentions Al-Hasan ibn Haytham. He says Al-Hazan, but Al-Hasan ibn Haytham, he didn't talk much about him. But yeah, the world's first true scientist. It's a huge thing to mention for those people, especially today in this day and age in the West, who are fascinated with science. They don't understand. He's the first person to develop the modern scientific method, this idea of experimentation, repeatability, and falsification. And you can say the inventor of camera. These two ideas in his book, Optics, right? You can see this idea, and he says that it influenced the Renaissance, right? The idea of like from 14th to the 17th century, where Europe actually was revived, and they started using that knowledge. But nobody talks about where this knowledge came from, where they revived from this dark ages into the ages that they became later on. So the reality is this knowledge was all exported, taken away from the Muslims, people like these individuals were mentioning. He didn't mention many people, like, for example, Abbas ibn Firnas, the first human being to fly in human history, for example. And so many people, some of the names that he's mentioned and more, and many, many more, that are not highlighted in Western history for a reason. And I mentioned that reason, obviously. Al-Zahari
is the father of surgery. At this time in world history, the very best hospitals are in the Islamic world, by far. This is the first 24-hour hospital in Baghdad. What's also amazing about these hospitals is that if you are poor and could not pay, you could receive medical treatment for free. That was just part of the faith. All poor were treated with great charity and kindness during the Islamic Golden Age.
So here he talks about the first 24 hours hospital in Baghdad. And he mentions this very important point that treatment wasn't only 24 hours, but it was free for everyone. Now, even in this day and age today, the people who want to talk to us like they are coming from a moral high ground and enlightenment period and whatever, they don't have like this idea of treating you for free. You have to pay in most places. And if there is free health service in many countries, it's the worst service that you could possibly have. This was the peak of civilization, a peak of medicine, and it was for free. And it was for everyone, anyone who is sick.
This is Al-Qarawiyyan. Again, guys, I don't speak Arabic. I'm probably butchering the name. But it was founded in 859 in Fez, Morocco. This is important because this is actually the first degree-granting university in the whole world. It's still there, guys. Okay? This is the oldest university in the world. What's also amazing is it was founded by a woman who inherited a fortune from her father, and she spent all her money on building this university.
So here he also mentions the first university. So we're talking about the first 24 hours hospital, then we have the first university. A lot of the Westerns, like, listen to this information. They have no clue that this was the Islamic history that was going on. And in reality, the civilization that we're living in today is heavily, if not 90% of it, is built upon this Islamic foundation. Now, of course, we're not going to take the credit from the scientists and the intelligent people within the Western world who used this information and developed it and enhanced it in many ways. That is for sure the case. You take previous knowledge and you build upon it. But you don't take away the foundation, right? You don't take away the foundation. You don't show ingratitude to the people who allowed you to reach where you are today.
From 1300 to 1700, the world will be dominated by three major empires: the Ottomans, the Safavids in Iran, and the Mughals in India. They are collectively known as the gunpowder empires. So what's amazing is, since its inception about 622 up until the year 1700, the Islamic religion dominated the world. And so the question for us is, why was that the case? How did Islam overtake Europe and overtake Christianity? Okay, that is a mystery and question for us today.
A lot of people wouldn't want to answer this mystery with the simple idea that Muslims were people who were truly upon their faith, and they knew that they are upon the truth, and they knew that this religion comes from the Creator, and they implemented the teachings within their faith, which allowed them to become what they became. So that is our Islamic narrative. But you have a lot of people like, oh, it's a mystery. It's how did this happen? Well, it happened because of that reason. That's why if you look at these battles between Muslims and other empires, it wasn't like the Muslims were most sophisticated in their cavalry and in their weapons and their tactics. That wasn't the case. It was simply people who were a lot less equipped when it comes to military, when it comes to these ideas, when it comes to weaponry, but they were people of true faith. And that's why they were able to defeat people who were more advanced than them in these worldly aspects.
That we will look at. Okay, so let's go back to the three mysteries that I introduced earlier. Why do we have no written records? Even though we know that the people within the movement, Jews and Christians, knew how to read and write. Okay, that's the first question. Second question is, why didn't Muhammad name a successor? The third question is, why was the Al-Aqsa mosque built on top of the Temple Mount? Okay, so this is a paradox because Jews were an extremely important part of that early movement, right? So why would you offend the Jews like this? Right? Okay, to understand what happened, okay, let's go back in time. And we know that in 622, Muhammad goes to Medina, and that's what starts the Islamic movement. But let's just go over to Jerusalem and figure out what's happening there. And once we do that, then we're able to figure out what's going on in that world. It turns out that in 622, there's a major war going on between the two major powers at this time, the Persians and the Byzantines. And it is a deadly war that is engulfing the entire Middle East. Okay? So this is from Wikipedia, all right? Now, guys, never trust Wikipedia as a historical source, but it's useful for us to understand what contemporary historians think, okay? So this is from Wikipedia. The Jews have aligned themselves with the Persians. Why? Because, first of all, the Romans controlled Jerusalem, and in the year 70, the Romans burned down their temple, and in the year 135, the Romans expelled the Jews from Jerusalem, their holy city. So ever since then, the Jews, obviously they want revenge, but they also want to return to their holy city and rebuild the temple. And with the Persians, they saw this as an opportunity because historically, the Persians and the Jews have gone along very well. Okay? So the Jews helped the Persians take Jerusalem and push out the Byzantines. But when that happens, the Christians in Jerusalem, they revolt and they force out the Jews. And then the Byzantines, under their emperor Heraclius, they return Jerusalem in the first crusade. Okay, this is the beginning of the idea of crusade, and they retake the city. And then what they do is they expel the Jews from Jerusalem, obviously, but then they start to kill a lot of Jews. Okay, and they force these Jews outside of Jerusalem. So now these Jews have nowhere to go. But there's something called the Constitution of Medina in Arabia, right? There is a prophet, Muhammad, who is promising religious tolerance for all. All can practice their faith in peace, right? So it makes sense for a lot of these Jews, not all of them, but a lot of them, to join this early movement. What's important for us to understand is that at this point, Muslim, is not a distinct religion, okay? All these people are called believers because Muhammad sees himself as the final messenger of God, okay?
So of course that is false and ahistorical. That is false if you want to look at the Islamic records. That is false if you want to look at teachings of the Quran. As we mentioned earlier, the Quran addresses the Jews and the Christians and actually explicitly refers to them as disbelievers in many cases. You cannot say that they're all or communities of believers. They are called to the religion. Like I said, in many places, Allah says, "O people of the book, do not exceed in your religions. Do not go in exaggeration in your faith, in your religion." Allah says those who say Jesus is God are disbelievers. Allah mentions also that those who say that God is one of three or third of three are disbelievers as well. All of these are clear verses in the Quran. Allah says the Jews and Christians took Jesus and rabbis and priests as gods besides Allah. Allah says those who disbelieve from the people of the book and the polytheists are in the hellfire. I can go on and on and give you multiple examples. And these verses and these revelations were given. And it's not like the Prophet, this is the idea that he's trying to push. I'm going to explain to you why he keeps saying these things, which are ahistorical. Because he's trying to push an idea that in Islam, Prophet was like, trying to bring everyone together, right? It's just, which is partially true from the sense that the Prophet allowed them to practice their faith, but with the condition that there is no compromise. You believe in what you believe in, I believe in what I believe in. The Quran is clear. Allah says, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, say, "O disbelievers, I don't worship what you worship, and you don't worship what I worship. You have your religion, I have mine." So it's explicit in the Quran where it's clear that we have this idea of differentiation between Islam and corrupted traditions and beliefs and continuous teachings from the Quran to those individuals and those people that you have your faith and this faith has issues and problems. And Islam is a different idea, is a different religion. And it's not all one as he is trying to portray it in this way.
Abraham was the first, then you had Moses, then you have Jesus, and now Muhammad is the very last. So all these three different traditions, the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, and the Islam tradition, in the beginning were all just one religion, one idea, which is to bring God to earth and make everyone understand that God is the true God, okay? To create monotheism on earth. That's the origin of this new religion of Islam.
Yeah, so that part, in this case, is true in a way, which is the idea that Muslims believe that all the previous messengers were all Muslims, meaning they were all people who were submitting their will to the one true God. They're all submitting their will to Allah. But that doesn't mean now that the teachings that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ brought, that everyone is okay. If you stay as a Christian, you're okay. If you stay as a Jew, you're okay. If you stay, no. That Islam says that the main message of these prophets and messengers were Islam, but then people have corrupted and changed them. And when people have corrupted and changed them and added different beliefs into them, Islam comes to call people back to monotheism. Because now, like we said, they've left monotheism. Allah says the polytheists from the people of the book. So Allah is referring to them as being polytheists. So they have introduced polytheism into their religion. So Islam now is saying, no, you have to come back into true monotheism and the true teachings of these prophets and messengers who were Muslims. They're not Jewish or Christian. And Abraham was before Judaism and Christianity.
Okay, and this is the Constitution of Medina, which is in the Quran and which we know to be historically true. Maybe not the wording, okay? But we know that this existed. And these people were called believers. And also, this would also include people who believe in Zoroastrianism, okay? Because Zoroastrianism was also a monotheistic religion. So the Constitution of Medina was an attempt to unite all monotheistic religions into one single tradition that fought for God.
This is another clear example of something ahistorical, 100%. First, the Constitution of Medina is not in the Quran. The Quran doesn't mention Constitution of Medina at all, whatsoever. You guys can go and research that on your own. There's no such thing. And that's why he didn't bring a source for what he says. Then he says the Constitution of Medina included Zoroastrianism. What? Constitution of Medina had different sections where it included believers and commandments to believers, and then even sections for the Jewish people. For example, Jewish people cannot go and fight outside the Medina without the permission of the Prophet because it can influence the safety within the people of Medina. So a constitution of Medina highlighted the differences between the commands to believers and disbelievers, that what believers should do and what disbelievers are ought to do and not ought to do, and the freedoms that they have. But it certainly did not include Zoroastrianism and everyone was one, and the constitution of Medina is in the Quran. That's not only ahistorical, but that's an outright lie about what the Quran teaches, because it's not in the Quran and that's not what it says. That's why he didn't quote the constitution of Medina. He just keeps mentioning it, but he never quotes it. He never says what it actually says.
Okay. Also, what's really important for us to understand is not only is there all this persecution going on against Jews and against Christians and against Zoroastrians, okay? But also, this is a apocalyptic age where all three traditions believed this was literally the end of the world. If you were Jewish, you believed in a final battle called Armageddon between the Messiah, who would lead you, and against two enemies called Gog and Magog. Okay, guess what? The Persians and the Romans were fighting each other. So you can easily interpret this to mean the Persians and the Romans were the Gog and Magog enemy. In your tradition, this would be the final battle. This is when Jerusalem is most threatened. Well, the Romans, the Byzantines, just took your city and mastered your people. So in the Jewish tradition, this is the end of days. This is the final battle. And the Messiah would emerge to lead you to final victory. And that person, a lot of Jews could interpret to be Muhammad, okay? So for the Jews, this is the end of days.
I'm sorry, what? Like, there's no way he's actually just said this. I mean, that's why I'm saying when, like, a lot of this information is not just ahistorical, it's like outright nonsensical, sorry, with all due respect, like, but it is completely false in every single way possible. Yes, okay, the Jewish people are waiting for the Messiah. As today, they are still waiting for the Messiah. It's the same idea. But those Jewish people are waiting for the Messiah. Not a lot of them, as he said, believe that Prophet Muhammad is the Messiah. That's crazy. Because the Jewish people believe that the Messiah is going to come from the lineage of David. Prophet Muhammad is coming from Ishmael. The Arab tribes are coming from Ishmael. And that's why you had those same Jewish people that you're talking about, that you're trying to say that they were like some sort of finding peace and harmony within Islam and the Islamic tradition. Even though there was, like I said, harmony and freedom of faith, they were not accepting Prophet Muhammad. These Jewish tribes that you're mentioning, that you're talking about right now. You put the Jewish tribes on your screen there. Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayza, Banu Qaynuqa. These three Jewish tribes, or these main Jewish tribes that exist, all of them had treaties with the Prophet and broke their treaties. Every single one of them. Every single one of them broke the treaties. Some in Uhud, some of them tried to assassinate the Prophet ﷺ. Others in the famous incident of Banu Qurayza in the Battle of Ahzab or Khaybar. So it's like they did not agree with the Prophet ﷺ, and they would come to him and discuss with him and have discussions about the religion and ask him questions. Yeah, there was some Jewish people that accepted, because the description of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wasn't actually in their book, in which they were hiding and concealing and corrupting. But the overwhelming majority did not accept, because their idea of Messiah, for sure. Now, let's highlight two very important things here. Why this is like I'm saying, completely false in every single way. Because first, number one, like I said, the Jews believe that the Messiah is from the lineage of David, can never be Prophet Muhammad to the Jewish people. Impossible. Now, number two, Islam affirms that Messiah was Jesus that came before, which would upset all of these Jewish people. It's not like he's trying to bring them in harmony. The Quran explicitly says, Al-Masih Isa ibn Maryam, the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary. So not only are you incorrect about the beliefs of Jewish people, which is very obvious in this case, like I said, this is like ABC history and theology. But you're also incorrect about the claims Prophet Muhammad made, because explicitly he says in the Quran that Jesus was the Messiah. And the Messiah will come again, not him. So it's impossible for you to say that these Jewish people were all coming because it's the end of times and they were thinking Prophet Muhammad was the Messiah and we're going to follow him. So I'm sorry, but this idea is really, really ahistorical in every way possible.
But for Christians, okay, they also believe this is the end of days, because there was a final battle between the Antichrist and the Messiah, okay? The Antichrist is obviously Heracles, who is the emperor of the Byzantines, who've been persecuting Christians for a long time. Remember, the official religion of the Byzantines is the Holy Trinity. But most Christians didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, and they were persecuted for their refusal to believe in the Holy Trinity, okay? So for Christians, this is also the final battle. Zoroastrians believe in a final battle between good and evil, okay? So this is an apocalyptic age where everyone believes this is it, the final battle. Muhammad is saying to everyone, guys, we're all one people. united by God. And we are here to fight for him. Okay? And this is very appealing.
So now you see, again, he's misrepresenting Christians as well. I'm not a Christian, but he's definitely misrepresenting the Christians because, again, the Christians believe that Jesus was the Messiah in the past. You cannot think it's Prophet Muhammad or something to be the Messiah, coming to fight Hercules, the Antichrist. That's not going to happen. They didn't believe that. And they believed in the second coming of Jesus, as Muslims also believe in the second coming of Jesus. So the Jesus of the past wasn't there. So they're not going to believe this is the end of times and the Antichrist is being fought when Jesus isn't there. And the Roman Empire, it's true that it's persecuted Christians, but that was before the Roman Empire adopted Christianity. So when you have in the 4th century Constantine adopting Christianity, at that day and age, the Roman Empire was not persecuting Christians. So that's false. And when you had the councils being set forth, and then these beliefs of Christians believing in the Trinity, when you say the Christians didn't believe in the Trinity in Arabia, that's also false. There's many Christians who did believe in the Trinity. It's true that the first groups of Christianity, like the Ebionites and these groups, did not believe in the Trinity. But later on, after the Roman Empire adopted Christianity at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, this idea was already changed. And majority of the Christians were believers in the Trinity, and the Roman Empire was not persecuting them as you claim. In fact, the Quran explicitly, like I mentioned before, it talks to the Christians. Those who say that Allah is third of three are disbelievers. Do not exceed in religion and do not say that Jesus is God. Do not transgress in your religion. Allah is only one God. Do not say three. All of these things were explicitly refuting the idea of the Trinity and divinity of Jesus, which is a part of the Trinity. So that means if the Prophet is telling them that and having debates with the Christians of Najran, the Prophet had discussions with the Arab Christians of Najran about Jesus' divinity. So that means they believed it at the time. So what you're saying is, I'm saying is historical in every way, and it's misrepresenting faith. And definitely the Zoroastrians were not thinking Prophet Muhammad was their like savior in the end of times. But like I said to you guys, he's presenting this idea because he believes in a theory and he wants to establish a theory to be true. But what he's presenting is all historical and incorrect when we look at the lens of what actually people believe and actually the evidences that we have. That's why he's not mentioning evidences. He's just given his personal opinion in this case.
For people. So the best evidence for my argument is actually the Quran. Okay? So again, we don't have any written records of Muhammad. But what we do believe is the Quran. It is a collection of many of Muhammad's original sayings that have been redacted over time. Okay? So let's look at some passages from the Quran to better understand how Muhammad was thinking and what he was preaching to the Christians, the Jews, and the Zoroastrians.
Again, that is insane to say. Like it's first, within the Islamic tradition, whether you believe it or not as a non-Muslim, but within the Islamic tradition, the Quran is the word of God, it's verbatim, first-person word of God, the Creator himself. It is not the words of Prophet Muhammad at all, whatsoever. See, we don't have history of Muhammad. I'm going to refute the idea later on. We do have history. That's false. But there's a difference between what the Prophet said and what the Quran says. The Quran is not the words of Prophet Muhammad. So, and then redacted over time. Like, who believes that? Like, even Western historians that studied the manuscripts of Sana'a and these places, they all say that the Quran is preserved in the same way. So this idea is like absolutely false in every way, shape, or form.
All right. All people of the book. By this he means both the Christians and the Jews, okay? Why do you argue about Abraham when the Torah and the gospel were not revealed until after him? Will you not reason? Okay, so he's saying, why are we arguing about scripture? Why are we arguing about belief? When we all acknowledge that Abraham is our forefather, okay? And Abraham came before the Bible. It came before the Old Testament and the New Testament. So what's the argument? Here you argue about things you know, but why do you argue about things you do not know? Allah knows and you do not know. Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was a monotheist, a Muslim, okay? So this is what Muhammad is saying. A Muslim is someone who believes in God as the only true God, and that includes Jews and Christians.
Okay, we've already refuted this idea, as I said. And if it did include Jews and Christians, then this verse would not make any sense. The Prophet wouldn't be talking to them and telling them, oh, people of the book, why are you arguing? So that means they're arguing about Abraham. They're disagreeing with the teachings of Islam. And they, like I said, the Quran explicitly calls them polytheists. That's why the verse says, and he was not of the polytheists. He was a monotheist. You guys are being polytheistic. Don't be polytheistic because Abraham was a monotheist. So it doesn't say that it includes them. The Islam includes them, but it says what they believe right now has been corrupted and changed. And the true religion of Abraham, the true religion of the prophets of God is pure monotheism that they are no longer upon and they became polytheists.
Let's also look at Muhammad responding to the Christian tradition. Okay, in the Christian tradition, a lot of conflict arises from a debate over the nature of Jesus and his relationship with God. Okay? And what Muhammad is saying is, guys, the idea of Jesus makes no sense. Jesus cannot be God. Jesus, at best, can only be a messenger of God, just like me. And the idea that Jesus is God makes no sense. Jesus was a human, just like me. God is God. He would not represent himself through a human. Okay? And so let's look at what he says. They disbelieve those who say Allah is the Messiah, the son of Mary. But the Messiah himself said, Messiah is Jesus, right? O children of Israel, worship Allah, my Lord and your Lord. He's making a clear distinction. God is my God. I'm not God. I'm not his son. He is God. Whoever associates others with Allah, Allah has forbidden him paradise, and his dwelling is the fire. The wrongdoers have no saviors.
Now, he's brought verses which are refuting what he says, because these verses are talking to the Christians and Jews. And it says they disbelieve. And the next verse says they disbelieve. It says Allah is the third of three. So he's bringing these verses. She's actually refuting his narrative, where the Prophet is telling them that you guys are disbelievers, because you believe these things. So it's not the Constitution of Medina include all the believers, included them, and that they're also Muslims. Or would it make sense if he will call them Muslims and disbelievers at the same time, which is the two opposites? So, yeah, obviously that's not accurate at all, and it's a false representation of what the Quran is saying.
So Muhammad's final message to the people is, God is God and only God, and he is everywhere. And you can see him, you can touch him, because he's everywhere. And as such, you can feel him, and he can be inside of you. Okay? And so this idea will actually occupy most of the Quran. Okay? And this is what he says. With him are the keys of the unseen. None knows him except he, and he knows everything on land and in the sea. Not a leaf falls, but he knows it. And there is not a single grain in the darkness of earth, nor is there anything wet or dry, but is in the clear record.
So now, I'll tell you also why this is obviously false, because he just read a verse that has nothing to do with God being everywhere. And Muslims believe that this is actually polytheism, to believe that God is everywhere. But the reason he's bringing this is because this is his personal belief. He said in a different interview that he believes that, God, you have divinity within you in a way, or that God, you have the divine spark within you. This idea, he believes in it. But now he's pushing it on Islam, or he's pushing it on the Quran. That's not what we believe. That is completely false. That's not our tradition. That's not what we believe. The Quran is explicit, which says Allah is above his throne. Allah explicitly mentions in the Quran that Rahman al-Arsh istawa. And Allah is above everything that we see. أَأَمِنْتُم مَّن فِي السَّمَاءِ. Do you feel safe or free from the one who's above everything, in highness, or above the sama, above the creation that we see? So Allah is above everything. So the Quran is explicit on this idea that Allah is above everything. But yes, Allah is present in his knowledge. He knows everything and he sees everything. So this verse that you read, it's all about knowledge. There's nothing except that God knows. He knows about the leaf when it falls. He knows. It's all about knowledge, not the actual existence of God, which is polytheistic faith and belief. The pagan Arabs used to believe something similar to it. God can be present in different things. But this is what they were being refuted. They were being refuted by the Prophet Muhammad, by the Quran. So to claim that the majority of the Quran talks about God being here is like absolutely insane, because that is what majority of the Quran is refuting, the idea of polytheism. You're introducing a polytheistic belief and claiming that it is in the majority of the Quran. That is definitely not true.
Okay? And so, in other words, what's happening is that Islam is really the first monotheistic religion in the modern sense. Okay?
No, Islam is not a monotheistic religion in a modern sense. Islam is a monotheistic religion in every way, nothing about being in a modern way.
All right. So, what's the power of Islam? And I want you guys to remember this. Islam is, the power and beauty comes from how Islam is able to unite two major intellectual traditions in the world. The first is paganism, right? Remember the Vikings? The Vikings told stories, they acted out rituals. And therefore, there was an intimacy, concreteness, and interconnectedness to paganism that made us feel happy and good. Okay? It made us understand the world. It made us feel as though we could influence the world. That's the power of paganism. But Islam is doing the same thing by making God concrete. Okay? You can feel God. God is everywhere. He knows everything. But what Islam is also doing is, he's seeing the simplicity, clarity, and absoluteness of monotheism. Okay? Monotheism is nice because with monotheism, everything becomes clear to you. Right? Okay, there's one God. Therefore, I just have to follow him. I just have to believe in him. There's like a million gods in paganism. And so it's unclear what you should do or how you should relate to this million gods. But here in monotheism, the relationship between God and you, it's very, very clear. Okay? So in other words, Islam is a major intellectual revolution in human history. And we have forgotten this because Islam, the idea, has embedded itself into modernity itself. Okay? Does that make sense?
No, it does not make sense because it's definitely a contradiction. You just presented the contradiction. You presented monotheism and polytheism. Well, like I showed you explicitly, the Quran says those who have, for example, the biggest enmity towards the believers are the polytheists. Allah explicitly says in the Quran, the polytheists are in the hellfire. Everywhere in the Quran, the entire Quran is talking about this. But you're trying to tell us that Islam is combining polytheism and monotheism, which are two contradictory ideas, into one. And while Islam is rejecting polytheism in every way, shape, or form. Tawheed, the main principle of Islam, the main teaching, and the greatest sin in Islam, which is what you're saying, which we call shirk or polytheism, which Allah says in the Quran that there is no sins except that God forgives, except polytheism. Any sin God can forgive except polytheism. Allah says in the Quran explicitly that in Allah la yaghfiru an yushraka bihi. Allah does not forgive or pardon anyone who does polytheism, associates with God. He forgives anything else for whom he wills. So if Allah will to forgive something else, he will forgive it. But polytheism is never forgiven. It's explicitly mentioned in the Quran. So how is Islam combining polytheism and monotheism? When Islam all over the scripture is refuting the idea of polytheism. Allah says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. Do not be from polytheists. Explicitly in the Quran. So to try and say that Islam was teaching polytheism, because like I said, he's saying that because he believes it. But in reality in Islam's core foundation is to reject polytheism and to affirm monotheism. Anything and any ideology that brings the idea of polytheism is completely and explicitly and clearly rejected within the Islamic tradition and absolutely unaccepted. Now, the second part where he says about monotheism, of course, that is the core idea and foundation of Islam.
All right. So what I will show you over the course of this semester is that Islam really is the proto-modernity. When we say that modernity began in Europe, we forget that Islam really built the basis for modernity, okay? All right, so fulfillment of the law and prophets. It's completing the story in the Bible.
Okay, first, the idea of the fulfillment of the law of the prophets. That's something that is Christian, not Islamic. And Jesus is allegedly attributed to Jesus in Matthew, where he says, I did not come to destroy the law of the prophets, but I've come to fulfill. So you cannot claim, while they already believe that Jesus was a fulfillment there, that Prophet Muhammad is fulfilling the story. No, you cannot claim that. And Christians are already believing their story is over. Prophet Muhammad cannot be the fulfilling of the Christian story. Well, Christian story was about the original sin and all of that. That was a Christian story at the time of Prophet Muhammad. The corrupted Christian story of the idea of original sin and someone coming down for the sins of mankind, being divine, which is Jesus. The story is already over. Prophet Muhammad cannot come and fulfill it. It's already been fulfilled. So that is definitely false.
It's bringing God to the people. You can now touch God. You can now know God. That's the beginning of the idea of Protestantism, okay?
Again, bring God to the people. That's again a Christian idea. I don't understand how you are claiming that it's not a Christian idea, an Islamic idea, when it's a Christian idea where they say that God himself becomes a human being and comes to earth so he can relate to the people. That's a Christian idea. Muslims don't say Allah enters the creation at any point. They don't believe that. The creator, the supreme, does not get limited by anything within the creation. That's a Christian belief. It's not an Islamic belief. But in some way, you're presenting it here as an Islamic belief, and it's not.
And create heaven on earth. And this is the idea of science. Why do we use science? To make the world better. Because God wants us to make the world better. All right?
There's nothing in Islam where it says create heaven on earth. It's clear in the Quran that heaven is in the afterlife. It's a place after resurrection, after death. It's a physical place. It's a place where human beings are going to be. And they're going to get gardens. They're going to get rivers. They're going to enjoy like these beds and these places. And they will see God. All of that is in the afterlife. So heaven is an actual place there. There's nothing in Islam that teaches you that heaven is science or within this world. But Islam teaches you to seek knowledge. Islam teaches you to observe the world. Islam teaches you to become specialized in different fields and become knowledgeable and expand upon the knowledge that you have and share with people. We believe in that, but that's not heaven. Like, that's a complete different idea.
All right, so let me really quickly answer the three mysteries.
So now let's get to the idea of the three mysteries, right? He says it's mysteries. Let's see his idea of what the answers to the mysteries are. And then let me give you the actual answers to these questions.
Okay, the first problem is, why were there no written records? The answer is, first of all, Islam marks a revolution. Okay? It is overturning the social order. The problem, though, is that eventually Islam will become the social order. So you obviously don't want to paint Muhammad as a revolutionary. Okay? That's the first problem. Muhammad represented a revolution against the social order. All right, that's the first thing.
Okay, so let's refute this first thing, right? Prophet Muhammad was a revolutionary and Muslims did not want to paint him that way. But that is our belief in a way. He was a revolutionary against the polytheism. And that is in all Muslim records that you're claiming that Muslims, did not want to paint him to be a revolutionary. But he came with this idea, that's our belief, that he was within a society that everyone believed opposite to what he believed in. They were all polytheists. And he was the only person who brought this revolution of monotheism as a prophet and messenger of God to bring people back to worshiping God alone. That's what we believe, literally. That's all what the records that we have Prophet Muhammad indicate, that he was a revolutionary. So this idea that they didn't want to paint Prophet Muhammad as a revolutionary is crazy, because that's exactly what Prophet Muhammad did. All his people said, just stop changing these traditions of our forefathers and bringing this revolutionary idea, if you want to call it, even though we're not saying it's a revolutionary idea, because Prophet Muhammad is saying that this same idea existed in the previous prophets and messengers. So it's more reviving a tradition that was there. It's not a revolution. It was a reviving something already was present. You yourself highlighted that when you said that Prophet Muhammad was talking about Abraham being a Muslim, being a monotheist. So he's reviving something, but it's also a sense of a revolution against the beliefs that people had. So this idea that they like hid history so they don't make Prophet Muhammad a revolutionary is insane. When the Islamic tradition, anyways, says that Prophet Muhammad came with this idea that was against what people believed in. Also, it's not only a revolutionary against the polytheism of the pagan Arabs, but it's also against the Jews and Christians. And you'd see this Islamic tradition, even Bukhari, which is a book of hadith, talks about the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. This is the entire chapter about opposing the Jews and Christians in the habits and actions that we do. So Prophet Muhammad was not trying to unite them, as he said, under one bannerism of being Muslims. That he told us actually go against the Jews and Christians and do this, for example, do this specific tradition. So if the Prophet is telling us that, then we're opposing them, we're going against them. So we're even having a revolution against those corrupted, what we believe are corrupted beliefs that the Christians and the Jews are having at the time in the deserts of Arabia.
Second thing is that we know that his early followers, the companions, were all wiped out. They're all dead. They all died. The official history says that they died in military conflicts.
Okay, that is completely false. I'm sorry, but like, come on. I mean, if you wanna come and say Prophet Muhammad prior to his death, he gave the last ceremony, and it was to 120,000 companions. 120,000 companions. To claim that every single companion died and they disappeared or something, if you mean they died like normal human beings, yes, they did die like normal human beings. But to claim that the companions of Prophet Muhammad all died in the battlefield, that is a complete nonsense that anyone can refute. We have many companions that lived into very, very late ages after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Many companions, like Anas ibn Malik and other companions of the Prophet. To say that all of the companions of the Prophet, the sons of those companions also being alive. But the fact is, after the Prophet, all the Arabian Peninsula was a Muslim peninsula, and it was like 100,000 Muslims within there. So to claim that all of the companions of the Prophet died in the battlefield is completely false within every historical tradition, and everyone who opens any historical book, any Islamic historical book. You had, like I said, like the first caliphate of Islam was a companion, second caliphate, third caliphate, fourth caliphate, fifth caliphate. They were all companions of the Prophet. And they were tens of years, some of them after the Prophet. They were companions of the Prophet. And they were alive. And within the ages of all of these companions that were rulers, that were caliphates, within their ages, they were companions living as well. So yeah, it's absolutely false to say that they all died in the battlefield. In fact, it's something quoted often about Khalid ibn al-Walid, who we call the sword of Allah, who was fighting against the Roman and Persian empires, who was like, you can say, the greatest warrior in the Islamic history after the Prophet in that period. They say that he died on his deathbed. So he was fighting all these battlefields and he died on his deathbed. So that's like completely and entirely false.
But here's the amazing thing about early Islam history. We don't have that much evidence of military conflict between the Arabs and the Persians and the Byzantines. We don't. There's maybe one city, Sisera, where there was a siege. But we think that a lot of the conquest happened organically, or maybe their enemies surrendered to them rather than fight them, okay? And that's why I would say it's a revolution.
That's actually also entirely false. We do have a lot of records mentioning the battles between the Muslims and the Romans and the Persians. That is completely false. And look, the easiest way to refute this idea is for anyone to just go online and look at any lecture about the Islamic wars and history between Muslims and any of these empires. And you'll find many, many lectures given by non-Muslims, by historians, telling you about the incidents and quoting these non-Muslim sources about the fights and the battles and the number of armies in these battles that took place and how they won and what the tactics were being done and being held. Like, so I'm sorry, but like you're making a lot of generalizations that are false. I mean, you can make generalizations in a certain case, but not in a case like this where things are explicitly, clearly false.
It's not a conflict, it's not a conquest, it's a revolution where ordinary people were so disgusted with the current leadership that they opted for a new belief system.
But you see, he has a belief now, which is this belief that he has, and he is trying to paint the Islamic narrative within, or put the Islamic narrative and include it within the belief that he already has, which is ahistorical. But also, like, as I promised, guys, of course I'm going to respond to what he's saying, like this claim, first claim that he made, why is there no historical records? I didn't answer that one, but I'll answer it for you guys right now explicitly and clearly. The reason is very simple. First, the idea itself is false. There's no historical records in the first 100 years of Islam. That is absolutely false. And I'm going to tell you why it's absolutely false. And I'm going to give you proofs why it's absolutely false. But I'm going to tell you why, even pre the Islamic era, we didn't have that many writings anyways. We barely have anything from that era. Pre-Islam, not even post-Islam, the first 100 years. And the reason is very simple. The reason is, the Prophet Muhammad himself says that نحن أمة أمية لا نكتب ولا نقرأ. We are an illiterate nation. That was the nation of the Arabs. You're an illiterate nation. The Prophet says, لا نكتب ولا نقرأ. We don't write, we don't read. That is, as a nation, you had very few people who are literate. And those Jewish people also were living in that environment. They were also carrying the Arabic culture. They were people who would rely on the oral tradition and memorization. And the Arabs would compete with each other when it comes to the oral tradition and poetry. They wouldn't rely on writing as the main thing. So if it was an illiterate nation, they were not known of this idea to record their history. And that's why when the Quran was sent down, when they were writing down, they wrote down on whatever they had, whether it is pieces of leather or tree leaves or anything, whatever they had, rocks, anything that they could write on, they would write on. Because it was not a literate nation with like printers where they would write their history like it is today in the modern era, or like other civilizations. So this idea that why we don't have like so many writings or whatever is refuted by the idea of understanding how the Arabs were. They weren't people who were writing. Now, let's refute this idea. There is nothing. There is so many writings. Of course, first thing, we know the Quran. We have the Quran from the 1st century, 2nd century onwards. We have the Quran. We have portions of the Quran from the life of the Prophet ﷺ written. And he's claimed the Quran is from Prophet Muhammad. So that is something written from the Prophet with your own criteria. We have the Birmingham manuscript. And we have the full Quran, of course, from the late 1st century, early 2nd century, preserved. So we have writings. Then we have the hadith, the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, the history which records his life, which you're now telling us there's nothing about the early Islamic movement or early Islam. That's false. Because that hadith not only records the life of the Prophet, but there's a hadith about also the caliphates and the differences that happen between the companions and all of these things, and the wars that happen between Muslims and other nations. All of these, we have them recorded in the hadith, in the narrations and traditions. And we have, for example, this Haifa, which is a parchment of someone called Hammam bin Munabbih, who was born, like, let's say 20 years after the Prophet, 10 or 20 years after the Prophet. And we have his parchments, which have tens or hundreds of narrations from the Prophet. We have also history, books of history, the Sirah, that writes the biography of the Prophet and his life, that are so early. Like you have the one by Ibn Ishaq, but we have one as well that is earlier, that is Maghazi Musa ibn Uqba. And Musa ibn Uqba was born in 60 AH. Ibn Ishaq was like 80 AH or something. So they're both born in the 1st century. And they're born like, let's say, 50 to 70 years after the Prophet ﷺ. They're born in that time. So if they're born within this time period when they were 30 or something and they wrote their biographies, they were writing in the 1st century, the first 100 years of Islam. They were writing the history that was already recorded, that was there, of what the Muslims were doing. The life of the Prophet and the history of Muslims as well. We have these things today, present. So the claim that like, oh, we don't have any records is false. But like I said, even the idea of the Quran itself, it records what Muslims did, what the teachings between the Prophet and the companions. This is a record in its own. But the hadith, which we have tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of, that are all tracing back with chains of narrations and authenticity and historical reliability to the individuals who are living in the time, the companions. We have tens of thousands of narrations from those people, talking about the history of the life of the Prophet, the history that happened after the life of the Prophet and onwards. So this idea is completely false, that we have nothing from the 1st century. It is absolutely and completely false. in every way, shape, or form. So that is the answer to your first mystery. Let's see what's the second mystery.
Okay. The problem, though, is that once you amass power, and it's a coalition, the question then is, who's now in charge? So for the next 50, 100 years, there'll be a series of civil war to determine who will be in charge, okay? Those early companions were probably purged. The word we use is purge. They're wiped out, including the Jews and the Christians.
But this idea is completely false, because we know we have even Jews today in Yemen, like until this day. And we have Christians in Egypt and many other places. You say it's companions of Persia. Even the Christians in Egypt, for example, they have a history of Amr ibn al-As, the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, coming and what he did. And that they remained there from that time. They have an entire book of history called the Sangsar in Arabic, where they record their Coptic church history and how Muslims treated them and all of that. Claim all the Jews and Christians died. This is like completely false. Like really, I'm sorry, but it is very, very ahistorical. And I mean, I don't know what to say at this point.
But not only that, and the third thing is that there'll be a series of continuous civil wars among the Arabs in order to determine who will be the caliph. And obviously, they want to disguise this history. They want to disguise this history of civil conflict, okay? So the first 100 years, it was revolutionary, but it was also very tumultuous and bloody. And that's why they had to disguise the first 100 years of Islamic history.
And then he says that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were fighting and like fighting for caliphate, and we want to disguise this history. That's also false. Explicitly false. We talked about separation between Muslims, and you have the idea of Sunni and Shia, and you have the disagreement about who should have been the leader. We have all of these historical resources talking about the dispute that happened at the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, which is a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. We have the differences that happen between them, and the battles that happen between them, like Siffin and Al-Jamal, all of these battles, we have the history record of them. Why they happen, how they happen, all of that, and these differences and conflicts between the Prophet. In fact, the Prophet himself tells us that the nation will divide after him. Muslims will divide. And he tells some of the companions that they will be killed. Like he tells us that Uthman, the third caliphate, will be killed. The second caliphate will be killed, will die as a martyr. He will be killed. And he tells Uthman specifically that there will be a great trial that will happen to him, and he has to be patient. And he was killed in a riot that happened against him where people killed him. So not only the Prophet tells us these things will happen, but we have a history, a record of all of these disagreements. Muslims are not the ones who hide their history. In fact, most of the critiques that comes against Muslims comes from their own sources, because we record the true history of what happened. So people come critique us, they go to the Tariq al-Tabari and Ibn Ishaq and whatever, and they take some narration, some weak and some not weak, and then they try to make these accusations and these arguments and these critiques against the Islamic tradition, because we have what happened in history in our books. We don't hide it.
And again, this is my explanation. I could be wrong.
So here he says, again, this is my explanation. I could be wrong, because he doesn't give any sources. And what he's saying is very ahistorical. But I have a problem with that, because he kind of tries to take away all accountability in his methodology. Because you're going on YouTube, you're teaching people, you're a professor, you're a graduate, and you're teaching people information. You can't say that, oh, this is just my opinion. And you're claiming, oh, my evidence is the Quran. So you're claiming that you're also offering evidence. So what you're teaching cannot be completely and entirely false like this. You cannot like completely escape accountability by just saying that this is my opinion, because you are distributing this information that so many people are listening to you, and they're taking you as an authority because you are a professor, and they're thinking what you're telling them is a fact and true.
There are many cultures who do not believe, or they don't have institutions to write down history. We sort of take it for granted today, but back then, it was actually a pretty rare thing to actually want to write down your history.
So here he refutes himself by saying that there are civilizations that were not writing down their history, which is mentioned, I think, by one of his students, which is a fact, which is what I was telling you, what the Prophet ﷺ told us. The Arabs were not known to be people who would record their entire history. They were an oral tradition people who rely on oral memorization.
All right. Second question is...
So here we go into the second question, the second mystery that he has.
Why didn't Muhammad name a successor? And again, this is just my theory. But if it's the end of days, if it's the end of the world, you don't need to name a successor, because God's coming, right? What's the point? In fact, if you name a successor, then you are admitting defeat, right? What Muhammad is saying to everyone is that every of your traditions, Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian, are right. It's the end of days. God is coming. There'll be peace on the world. Therefore, we will no longer need leaders. You won't need Muhammad. I'm the last prophet, man. Okay? So that's why I think he didn't name a successor. But there could be other explanations, okay?
So here we see, like I said, I told you guys that this idea of it being the end of time is false, and I refuted it in the beginning. But you see, he has to say this false idea so you can build this false explanation on it, that Prophet Muhammad did not name a successor because it was the end of times, that everyone believed that it was the end of times. But he didn't, because Jesus did not come back yet. the Jewish people were waiting for the Messiah, and Prophet Muhammad cannot be the Messiah. So it cannot be the end of times, and it cannot be the Prophet did not name a successor for that reason. And in fact, both the Sunni and the Shia tradition believe the Prophet named the successor. Of course, we disagree on who the successor was named, but both the Sunni tradition and the Shia tradition believes it. So the Shia tradition will tell you the Prophet ﷺ named Ali ibn Abi Talib as the successor. The Sunni tradition will tell you that the Prophet ﷺ named Abu Bakr as-Siddiq because a woman came and asked the Prophet ﷺ, if I don't find you here next year, he told her, if you don't find me here next year, she said, who should I come to if I don't find you here next year? He said to her, come to Abu Bakr. When the Prophet became sick, he put Abu Bakr to lead the people in the prayer. And all this was all among many, many other evidences the people of the Sunnah use, as that the Prophet ﷺ was telling the people, teaching the people that Abu Bakr was the person in charge after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And then the Shia, of course, tradition will tell you, no, it was Ali ibn Abi Talib, and they would refer to an incident that happened in history where the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever is an ally to me, they should also be an ally to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And they obviously interpret the word ally there differently. This idea that Prophet Muhammad did not name a successor is refuted both in the Sunni and the Shia tradition. So, I mean, if you read anything basically about what Muslims believe, you wouldn't come and say that Prophet Muhammad did not name a successor. He didn't say specifically in these words, if you want to say successor, he didn't use these specific terminologies, yes. But that had nothing to do, of course, with the idea of the end of times.
Do you have another explanation? Okay. The third is, why did they build the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the second temple, on the Temple Mount? And this explanation is going to be very controversial, okay? So the Jews support the Persians in the war against the Byzantines on the condition that the Persians would allow them to return to Jerusalem, but also on the condition that the Jews would be allowed to rebuild their temple. What I'm saying is this: Al-Aqsa Mosque was originally the third temple. It is what the Arabs promised the Jews for the support. But over time, as these purchases happened, as civil conflicts happened, then the Arabs needed to consolidate their authority. So they turned the third temple into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, that's what I think happened. If you go into I don't have time to go into the very detailed history of how the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built, but it was a process that took about 200 years.
So, of course, again, this is a very ahistorical and like false with every measurement claim. And I told you, he didn't even know that Qubbat Saqra, the Dome of the Rock, which he referred to as Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, is not even Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. He didn't even know that the Dome of the Rock isn't Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. But now he's also making false claims about Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa being built over 200 years. And that Muslims promised the Jews like rebuilding of the temple. Of course, he doesn't offer any evidence for that because there is nothing of that sort in Islamic history. And also we know, like I said, that like all the Jewish tribes in Medina, like I mentioned, they betrayed the Prophet ﷺ, there's treaties, and they all broke their treaties. So they weren't aligned with the Muslims. In fact, even against the fight with the pagan Arabs, like I told you, at the year 7 AH, they betrayed the Muslims and aligned with the pagan Arabs, and Muslims were in the middle, like they were ambushed by them. So this idea that like they promised them help us, and if you help us, we'll allow you to do this is completely false. Also, the Dome of the Rock, right? Why is it called the Dome of the Rock? Because the rock there is believed to be the rock where the Prophet ﷺ, where he did his journey of Isra and Mi'raj, where he ascended to heaven. The rock is there. So who built this Dome of the Rock? It was Abd Malik ibn Marwan, and it was in the year 66 AH. Way after the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. You have like 56 years or 60 years after the Prophet ﷺ. You have him building it. And it was a problem because Abdullah ibn Zubair was in Mecca. And Abdullah ibn Zubair, who was a son of a companion, one of the companions, he didn't agree with his authority, let's say, and he is speaking against him in Mecca. So he didn't like it. And what he did is he told the people, don't go to do pilgrimage in Mecca. But of course, people revolted. How are you stopping us from doing pilgrimage? So what he did instead is he said, okay, he built the people this mosque of the Dome of the Rock. And he says to people, okay, here's the mosque of the Dome of the Rock. So he can try and bring people closer to him. That was the reason why he built it. It was like he built that 66 AH for no reason to do with Judaism whatsoever at all. But this idea that the mosque was built in 200 years is false. Even the mosque of the Qibla, which I referred to, it was built by Umar ibn Khattab, like 15 AH or something, has nothing to do with the Jewish people as well, at all. So when you talk about history, neither of these two by themselves are Masjid Al-Aqsa. Like I said, it's the entire fenced area. Anyways, so he doesn't know what Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa is. He doesn't know what is the Dome of the Rock. He doesn't know when the Dome of the Rock is built. He doesn't know what is the historical significance behind the Dome of the Rock. So essentially, everything he's saying is false historically, and then he built this narrative, which is completely ahistorical, and he's kind of, in a way, trying to attribute it to history and to the Islamic tradition. So here are your great three mysteries, easily and very, very simply answered by a Muslim.
There's both strengths and weaknesses to all religions. So let's very quickly compare and contrast these three major religions to see why they thrive in a certain historical context.
So here he is going to compare between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity within his understanding of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
So, Judaism. The Bible, it's a wonderful piece of literature. It has a very rich history going back 1,000 years, right? So the Jews were the first to have a complete history of themselves. There are beautiful stories in the Bible that still inspire today. The stories of Adam and Eve, the stories of the patriarchs, the story of Moses. They still inspire us today, and they inspire us to create great literature. And then you have a literary culture. So the Jews were expected to be people of the book. They were expected to be literate in order to practice their religion. Okay? And this helps us understand why Jews are so dominant in academia, universities, in the media and in culture, and in the legal profession, okay? Because these are people of the book. They have a tremendous respect for learning and for literacy, okay? That said, there are certain problems with the tradition. The first is, it's contradictory. When you read the Bible, it's always contradicting itself, okay? It's almost schizophrenic, you could say. It's very hard to pick out a definite message from the Bible. And that's why the oral tradition, called the Torah, is actually much more important, okay? And so Jews have to go to the synagogue all the time, where the rabbi will explain to them the meaning of the Bible.
So yes, we may agree with the idea that there are contradictory teachings and traditions in the Jewish faith. Also, this idea that like Judaism is just like a literature culture and everyone is literate and whatever is not true. Even the Quran itself records where Allah says, وَمِنْهُمْ أُمِّيُّونَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ الْكِتَابَ إِلَّا أَمَانِيَّ. And among the Jewish people are illiterate people. They don't know the book. They don't know reading and writing properly. They don't know. They're illiterate people. So there were literate and illiterate people among the Jewish people. Yes, there was contradictory ideas. There was problematic ideas within the Jewish tradition. But this idea of faith against history, for example, that, if you believed in God, why are you being persecuted? That is not true also, because they were not holding on to their faith. If you read the Old Testament, if you read the Jewish tradition, God's constantly rebuking them for killing prophets, constantly rebuking them for committing blasphemy and polytheism, because every few hundred years, every few generations, they start polytheism. They start worshiping other than God, right? One after the other, one after the other. It's a polytheistic nation that keeps going back to polytheism every time, and God keeps sending them prophets and messengers. So they are being punished because of their disobedience. Even the Jewish people themselves will tell you that this is their history, where they have this idea of continuous kind of disobedience to God, and that's why they were being punished. So it's not like that they had great faith and then they were being punished at the same time.
Well, now we have Jesus, who we can understand. And Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice, therefore we know him to be the ultimate good. Okay? Second advantage is, now that there's a person, we can, for him, deliver a consistent message of being kind, being merciful, being loving. Okay? The third advantage is the idea of progress of history. Everything is leading to the return of Jesus, the second coming. Okay? So you may suffer now, but don't worry, because Jesus is returning. And that will end history for us. All right? So these are the advantages of Christianity.
Yes, of course, about Christianity. First, the idea about consistent message, that's not true, because they accept the Old Testament. And what you just said now about the Old Testament and the contradictory idea to what Christianity is it contradicted their belief. So it's not a consistent message, because they claim the previous prophets of God. Then you have the previous prophets of God teaching something, and then you have the new tradition teaching something completely opposite to it. So it's not a consistent message, actually. And yeah, obviously, it's the confusing part that completely agree with this idea that God was a human being, or the counterintuitiveness of the Trinity and all of these ideas. But distant divinity is not true, because they do believe God himself became a human being and was walking on earth so they can get closer to him. But he's trying to say distant divinity so he can claim that Islam brought God on earth, which is not true. So it's more of a Christian belief than it is actually an Islam belief. It is a polytheistic tradition.
And so Islam now makes sense, because it's trying to remedy and rectify these failings of Christianity. Okay? The first is that it takes the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition and makes it part of itself. Okay? So it is really the continuation and the perfection of the Jewish Christian tradition.
Now he talks about Islam, and he says that Islam is kind of taking advantages and mixing between Judaism and Christianity, which is again false, because like we said, the Quran is explicitly refuting and rebuking the major doctrines that Christians had at the time, and many of the major doctrines that the Jewish people had at the time about God. So it's not like adopting their ideas and bringing them together. So in fact, like I said, explicitly, you have many places the Prophet ﷺ tells us to go against the Jews and the Christians and their tradition. And again, this is based on his false premise that like the Constitution of Medina and this idea the Prophet is trying to bring everyone else under one idea of God. The absoluteness of God, of course, that's only existing in Islam, doesn't exist in the previous traditions. He's claiming is also there, but it's not. And the clarity of purpose and actions, absolutely, 100%. That is something that Islam has. And you see, his critique of Islam is like, he says it's too simple and clear. How is that critique for religion? It's not a critique. You even have in science this idea of Occam's razor, where they tell you that likely when you have different conflicting theories, that the simplest explanations is likely to be the true explanation. Of course, this is not an absolute rule that happens in every time and place, but it is an accepted idea that when you have these conflicting theories about something, that's likely the simplest explanation is the right explanation. So even if an explanation is simple and clear, in fact, that should be a good thing for people to like. That point that he's putting as a problem with Islam is actually something that is in line with Islam. Now, the idea of inflexibility is false because Islam, even though it claims to be an eternal tradition, as he says, but at the same time, Islam says that we have this idea, Allah says in the Quran, if a news comes to them of safety or fear, that they panic. But if they return it to the people of knowledge, people of Istanbul, the people who can look and study the tradition and come up with rulings, come up with understanding based on the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. So in Islam, even though that Islam is an eternal text, it has within it this inbuilt system of rules and regulations which can apply to every day and time and space until the day of judgment. And that's why we can have rulings with anything new. Anything that comes about, any issue that happens, we can have rulings in Islam that account and explain and answer these things. So this technology, we have rulings when it comes to Islam. All of the things that we have in the modern day and age, Islam has a ruling regarding it that is based on the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. So it's not inflexible. It's actually the most flexible tradition because it is meant to stay until the end of time. And to say that Islam is outside history is obviously like it makes no sense. Islam, Allah tells us in the Quran, قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, walk in the earth and see the outcome of the people who were before you. Look at the history of the people who were before you. Explicitly in the Quran, Allah tells us the history of the people of children of Israel. Allah tells us the history of the different civilizations, the beliefs of the people of Abraham. So Islam is within history where it talks about the people in the past, what they did, the mistakes that they committed, so we don't commit the mistakes. And also, the Prophet tells us about the future. The Prophet says the future, what's going to happen in the future, what to avoid, what are the major issues to avoid. But Islam also teaches you to increase in knowledge. And that's why we had this flourishing age of Islamic civilization, which you were talking about. And that comes from the idea of Islam teaching you to do that. That comes from the idea of Islam pushing this idea of being an innovative person and, inventing new things when it comes to the worldly aspect. But with Islam, yes, there are certain things, use the word dogma or whatever. If you mean by dogma something that Muslims believe that they stay upon, yes, there is something that remains to be the same because truth doesn't change. Truth is absolute, it's unchanging. So in Islam, the beliefs when it comes to God has always been the same and always remain to be the same. But the worldly aspects like science, technology, and these things can change. And the basic rulings in the day-to-day and what to do in the dealings between the people, these also can change in the time and place. But the core beliefs when it comes to who God is and what God does and what revelations he sent down, these are absolute facts and truths that don't change. And these are the aspects of Islam that needs to remain the same. And that is a point in the favor of Islam. Because if your core beliefs change, you're never going to be united. And you're going to have these conflicting ideas which keep changing, where people will fight with each other. And what the religion once was in the future is going to become something completely different because there is nothing that is a foundation of the faith that people can come back to. Now, obviously, he has a little bit more of the lecture and a few other things that he mentioned, but they're not really that important. Most of them are based on this false assumption that he's been making from the beginning, all the points that are refuted that he was making. So there's no need to answer the rest of what he was saying, which is like 10 minutes left or something or so of the lecture. And yeah, I would invite Professor Jiang to look into these things more and look at Islamic sources, because there are like some of the ones I mentioned that he's not aware of, or speak to a knowledgeable Muslim perhaps and ask questions. Like, you're welcome to ask questions. You're welcome to, if you have anything that you think that you is a mystery, rather than saying that nobody knows that mystery, you can ask someone perhaps that is knowledgeable about Islam. And we're more than happy to tell you the answers to the questions that you have or anything that you may think that you don't know. And by that, I'm going to conclude this video, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.